is Elise Gerstenecker. I'm the Curator of Decorative Arts here at Telfair Museums. It is my pleasure to work with the Friends of the Owens-Thomas House, one of our fantastic affinity groups here at Telfair. They are a group of individuals who are interested in architecture, decorative arts, and history. And as you could see on the presentation that was running before the lecture, they support all kinds of different activities at Telfair, including programming like this public lecture tonight. So if you're interested in joining, please, there's information on our front desk as you walked in. You're more than welcome to talk to anybody wearing a metal name tattoo who would be happy to talk to you about the Friends of the Owens-Thomas House. Tonight, we are lucky to be joined by Dr. Sandra Slater, who is an associate professor of history at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, where she also serves as an affiliate faculty member in Women's and Gender Studies, African American Studies, and she's the director of the Carolina Lowcountry in the Atlantic World program. She earned her PhD from the University of Kentucky in 2009, where she completed a dissertation on comparative 17th century Atlantic masculine identities in New France, New Spain, and New England. Her publications include a collection of essays co-edited with Dr. Faye Yarbrough, entitled Gender and Sexuality in Indigenous North America, 1400 to 1850, and a variety of articles in many publications, including the Historical Journal of Massachusetts, Masculinities, a Journal of Identity and Culture, and the Journal of Early American History. Most recently, her article, The Erotics of Early America, was published in the Cambridge Companion to Early American Literature. And she has also recently completed a book manuscript, The Pomp and Pride of Man, Pride and Humility in Early New England. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Slater.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me here to the Telfair Museums and the Friends of the Owens-Thomas House to talk to you about masculinity in the Lowcountry and the early national period in particular. A special thank you to Elise, who has been a delight to work with, Jeffrey, who's going to make sure I don't mess this up technically, who's back in the booth. But thank you. Thank you for taking time to come and talk about this with me. And I'm a very kind of laid-back gal, so feel free just to be part of a conversation with me rather than a formal lecture. We'll just all enjoy it and have a conversation together. How about that? When Elise first reached out to me with this proposed subject, I'll admit that even as a gender scholar, I was really excited and a little bit overwhelmed because there's just so much to say. Manhood, as cultural expectation, varies over time and place, always malleable and in negotiation, as are all identities. Subject to larger political, economic, and cultural changes, the expectations of American masculinity defy singular identification and explanation. The field of gender and masculinities is rich in scholarship, focusing on regional distinctiveness, creating a complicated tapestry of national manhood. But how do we approach understandings of masculinity within a specific time and place? Early masculinity scholars focused on the family as the nexus of manhood. I think we can all agree that's kind of problematic. But it's a reflection kind of the nascent field of masculinity studies that followed the trajectory of traditional women's history of the 1970s and early 1980s, which focused on life cycles with particular emphasis on the household. We're beyond that now. As much as men define themselves and their cultural identities in relation to women, and here I would like to acknowledge that I am using the word men and women, but I acknowledge that those are problematic categories in terms of identity, and I'm happy to kind of break that down with folks a little bit later. And as much as they define themselves in relation to women, more often men understood themselves in relation to other categories of men. As scholar Sergio Lusan posits, in the pre-Civil War South, masculinity was a social designation that required testing and confirmation in public in the presence of other men. Among elite Southern whites, for example, a boy became a man when he proved to his community that he was one. In the 19th century world of social spheres separated along gendered lines, White men operated largely within homosocial spaces. They spent most of their time with other men. The Low Country in the early 19th century is a microcosm that can teach us not only what mattered to local expectations of performing an acceptable masculinity, but also how that identity distinguished itself as reflective of a specific historical moment. Following the American Revolution, expectations of civic duty, freedom, and an awareness of crafting a national identity affected masculinity in America in different ways and certainly by region. I've chosen to focus on the early 19th century specifically for this reason. It was a period in which everyone participated in constructing identities in the shadows of the founding fathers and mothers. A new people for a new nation. Scholars of Southern history often focus on the antebellum period, when expectations of gendered identity were more concretely reflected in increased regionalism and sectionalism of America. This period reflected a more firmly entrenched vision of Southern masculinity, hardened through generations of affirmed practice. My talk today asks the question of how those expectations began. What characteristics defined acceptable masculinity for young men as they navigated the process of becoming a man in the early 19th century in the Low Country, so antebellum. This lecture focuses on the process of becoming a member of the masculine gentry, privileged young men expected to become masters, and the juxtaposition of enslaved men and boys who were denied access to these cultural markers of manhood. In essence, we will be discussing masculinity and emasculation, a dialectical relationship crucial to the plantation economy of the Low Country. Scholars of gender in the antebellum period often identify honor as the primary motivation for Southern men's allegiances and behaviors, a deep dedication to regional identity reliant on the preservation of slavery as an institution. As historian Lori Glover evidences, reputation is a more apt description in the early national period. Long before the Southern states aligned themselves in defiance of national unity, people were far more likely to identify with their local region or state, a holdover from the colonial period. Far from a unified entity, Low Country gentry operated in locally distinct ways. Charleston in the 1820s had very little in common with Kentucky, which was a state in 1792, or Mississippi, a state in 1817. The rise of King Cotton and shared economic interest in protecting the institution of slavery unified the South beginning in the 1830s. When we discuss Low Country masculinity, it certainly laid the foundations for more hardened antebellum expectations, but it was decidedly a world unto itself. Young men's first allegiance was to family and maintaining a reputation that distinguished the extended political, economic, and social networks in which they lived, married, and conducted business. As Glover states, successful boys devoted themselves to family, distinguished themselves in society, and shone as ornaments in the young republic. Expectations were exceedingly high. Born into a world of rice plantations, sweetgrass, endless marshes swarming with mosquitoes, and increasingly rigid social and class distinctions, white masculinity defined itself in contrast to blackness. The plantation system, which spread throughout the broader South over the course of the 19th century, was rooted in the Low Country, a coastal region spreading across the Carolinas, Georgia, and northern Florida. And just because I'm more familiar with kind of the Carolina Low Country area, it tends to skew that way in our discussion today, although you can apply these to pretty much the entire Low Country region. The economic viability of rice and indigo in the colonial period resulted in reliance on enslaved laborers. It's no coincidence that an estimated 40% of all enslaved people in America came through the port of Charleston, South Carolina. As historian Peter Wood first noted 50 years ago, South Carolina was unique in its black majority. At the time of the American Revolution, 80% of the low country population was enslaved and black. The visibility of black bodies being hustled from stinking, damp ships, crammed into livestock holding pens, on auction blocks, working long hours in deadly rice fields, whipped and beaten, pervaded everyday life in the Low Country. Charleston, as most northern visitors noted, was filled with enslaved black craftsmen, traders, and shoppers, in addition to enslaved laborers in the fields. The task system of slavery, unique to the Low Country and Charleston in particular, allowed for black mobility, but under the ever-watchful eye of fearful whites. Remember that the Haitian Revolution had just happened one generation before. Slave badges, collars worn to evidence ownership by white masters, and permissive writs describing the errands and locations for individuals demonstrate that black mobility was incredibly policed. Visitors to Charleston in the early 19th century consistently remarked on the elegance and richness of the city, its famed hospitality and manners, and always on the visibility of blackness. Boys became men in a world where white masculinity defined itself in terms of mastery and dominance over black bodies. Manhood was jealously guarded as a privilege of whiteness. Seen as chattel property and increasingly dehumanized, black men were consciously denied the markers that distinguished manhood in the early 19th century. The counterpart of black oppression was the splendor of elite society. White society, an antiquated world well before the romanticism of Gone with the Wind, and this is no surprise to people of Savannah, right? Savannah and Charleston have these beautiful monuments. I would say monuments to whiteness, but maybe that's accurate. But beautiful architecture and landscapes and incredibly rich. Upon visiting Charleston, Frederick All Olmsted described the Low Country as the most essentially aristocratic in the world. Despite the egalitarian rhetoric from the American Revolution, Low Country planters maintained many of the ideas and traditions of British noble classes. Landed gentry in the early 19th century sought advice on rearing good sons from the 18th century publication by Lord Chesterfield, and I've put the full title up here, but it's more commonly known as Advice to His Son. Let's go with that. This holdover from the colonial period is not surprising given the emphasis 18th century planters placed, particularly those in Virginia, on mimicking the social graces and consumption patterns by English aristocracy. Prior to the American Revolution, wealthy and landed men of colonial America keenly felt their isolation and rejection from the social circles of the affluent English lords and ladies who viewed Americans, despite any accumulation of wealth, as uncouth, degraded cousins. As tobacco plantations flourished in Virginia in the 18th century, Americans, including many founding fathers, sought to replicate the styles and manners of their English counterparts through an emphasis on mastery. Kathleen Brown's Good Wives, Anxious Patriarchs delineates the process through which young planters insisted on mastery at all levels, mastery of enslaved people, families, economies, and moreover, and this is more important to the 18th century context, self-mastery, a controlled, even response, reflecting Enlightenment philosophies which emphasize the role of reason and emotional detachment. The rise of capitalism and industrialization dramatically shifted expectations of manhood in the new nation. Northern ideologies of the self-made man became the new romanticized idea. New Englanders in particular embraced a merit-based hierarchy of power rooted in hard work and self-determination. These ideas would be later fully codified by Ralph Waldo Emerson, a prominent New England intellectual, whose essay Self-Reliance still stands as a touchstone of new national ideology. This vision of Northern manhood, the self-reliant, self-made man, stood in contradiction to the hereditary masculinity of the Low Country. As sectionalism increased in the first half of the 19th century, Low country planter families increasingly associated these ideas with the anti-slavery rhetoric growing in the North, a position which threatened to undermine their entire social and economic standing. So instead, in direct opposition to emerging ideas of manhood in northern states, low country planters doubled down on a vision of manhood steeped in the management of slavery and its defense. Low country elite white families not only replicated the social standards of their colonial Virginian forebears, but adapted 18th century views. Mastery was a hallmark of low country masculinity, as it had been in the colonial period. But parents increasingly relied upon reputation of that mastery, a more holistic approach with more severe social consequences for deviation. Parental expectations of sons in the Low Country relied primarily upon what's known as, quote unquote, manly independence. Young boys were raised to have autonomy, but with the expectation of making the correct decisions according to the desires of their families and communities. Young men of the landed gentry were to be raised in deeply orchestrated manners and expected to receive a good education, distinguish themselves in an acceptable career, marry locally to increase prestige and financial prospects of their family, and to fulfill their civic obligations through community and political leadership, the last particularly powerful after the American Revolution. But there was most certainly a correct way to achieve manhood. The expectations of appropriate and acceptable behavior were instilled in young men from the cradle, being constantly reminded of their familial obligations. One errant son could derail the social standing of an entire extended network of kin. And yet low country parents rejected direct discipline or compulsions, instead relying upon guilt. Not much has changed, right? But violence and corporal discipline were deeply associated with the institution of slavery, perpetuated by white men who were never the recipients of violence. Black bodies were forced into compliance through force. Elite white men through gentle guidance, encouragement, and in the worst cases, threat of disinheritance and family exile. Parents taught their sons to walk a thin line between deference and adherence to familial and social expectations and independence. Young men grew up watching fathers assert dominance. It was a deeply patriarchal world where men bore the responsibility of dominance at home, on the plantation, and in the broader community. Paternalism, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, the distinctions between them if you like, but paternalism, which is a hotly debated concept more associated with antebellum white justifications for maintaining the institution of slavery, for the supposed betterment and the care of enslaved blacks. But this had yet to supplant the more rigid, though equally destructive, concept of patriarchy. The two work interchangeably in different contexts in this period. Society revolved around a young man's ability to navigate the expectations placed on him and to excel in all facets of life, to be therefore deserving of the power and authority which was his natural right. Scholars of masculinity in the early national period explain that being a man in the eyes of Southern elites demanded independence of economic circumstance, conscience, and action. This intense and racialized zeal for independence was rooted in slaveholding, and it set Southern elites on a course apart from their Northern contemporaries. Southern gentrymen defined their distinctive independence in contrast to slavery. Whites compelled submissiveness from their slaves and defined slaves as dependents and therefore debased. If you were a dependent, you could never be a man. White men considered dependence and submission anathema for themselves. Southern boys thus learned to privilege independent, the antithesis of enslavement, above all attributes, and to publicly exercise their prerogatives as elite white men. Fathers allowed freedom to young boys, but made clear the correct course of action. In cases of disobedience or deviations from that correct path, parents employed negotiation tactics, as well as the ever-present guilt. The reputation and social standing of the entire family depended upon sons dutifully progressing towards acceptable manhood. Letters from the period reveal that rather than threats or the most extreme course of disinheritance, most fathers sought to counsel their sons on their path with gentle reminders of their responsibilities. Rather than demanding his son Henry follow his advice, Edward Rutledge instead wrote to his son, the ultimate guilt trip here. I hope you will not think I have said too much. If you should be inclined to differ with me on this point, recollect that I have had the advantage of great experience, and that the experience and observation of an affectionate father transmitted to an admired son is sometimes the fairest part of his inheritance. Gentle parenting. For those whose fathers died in their youth, family members stepped in to remind young men of their responsibilities. John E. Calhoun Jr., not the Calhoun family, they intermarried, they were cousins. You know, in Appalachia, we say that family tree doesn't fork, right? Okay. He is such an example here. Later, a successful attorney and state senator from South Carolina, young Calhoun, was reminded of the weight of his name and legacy. A family friend counseled the young man to remember that his deceased father, quote, left a highly honored name behind him and left a duty to his son to emulate his course and to uphold that name. Letters reveal this to be a consistent refrain to young men. You must adhere to social expectations, become powerful and worthy men, and augment the family's prominence through cultivating a reputation for responsibility, maturity, economic and business acumen, intelligence, and civic virtue. It was a long list. It was not enough to be successful. Parents expected their sons to distinguish themselves in their profession and personal lives, to raise the bar for the next generation and bear the weight of those before them. Following the American Revolution, mothers became the guardians of their children's education and youth, and this was a new development for sons and daughters. But as boys approached adolescence, their upbringing and education fell to their fathers to instill proper masculine attributes. The rhetoric of independence, fresh in the minds of the post-revolutionary generation, fostered a sense of self-importance. To corral more excessive displays of willfulness, and there are plenty in the records, low-country elite families provided their sons with exceptional educations, designed to prepare them for professional and economic success, but to also foster social and cultural development. In a world where reputation mattered beyond all else, a quality education enhanced the prospects of a young man and signaled cultural literacy. Many elite families hired Northern tutors to educate their sons in preparation for college. Unsurprisingly, educators complained of their charges who were too willful, expressed too much freedom, and were widely considered to be incredibly spoiled by outside observers. Azel Backus, a very prominent tutor from New England in the 19th century, was the tutor to the prominent Rutledge family. And he expressed concern to John Rutledge that his son Robert, then 12, was especially overindulged. Backus commented, "He has acted to my view as if he expected to be little handsome Robert Rutledge forever, that his father and friends would be immortal supports, and that he had nothing to trouble himself about but to learn to dance, get a few Chesterfieldian airs," right, Chesterfield furniture, "and be carried into a bandbox to all the balls, baths, and theaters of the world." Entitlement, right? But without question, Southern sons were pampered. Parented gently by their mother and father, these young men also learned from infancy their dominance and power over enslaved people. Outsiders frequently commented that elite white children constantly received the attention and care of and by enslaved people who were then commanded to satisfy their every whim. It was perfectly acceptable for an 8-year-old boy to physically assault a 40-year-old enslaved black person, and no one blinked an eye. Endowed with this immense power from infancy, young boys in the Low Country exercised it freely, enacting violence on enslaved adults and children without consequence. It was no doubt difficult to instill submission in young white men who from their infancy learned that submission was the role of the enslaved. Young Daniel Horey, of the notable Pinckney-Horey family in the Low Country, began his formal education in England at age 11 after family members became frustrated by his perpetual misbehavior. A tutor wouldn't work, local schools wouldn't work, they had to ship that kid across the Atlantic. Relatives such as Eliza Lucas Pinckney and Charles Coatsworth Pinckney expressed concern. Daniel's uncle Thomas lamented that the young Horey spent his days, quote, rioting with all the little dirty boys in Charlestown, end quote, instead of devoting himself to studies. The entire kinship network, and this was very common, weighed in, and despite their efforts to keep Horey on the path to manhood, he nevertheless failed to meet the mark in his youth. His behavior only worsened at his boarding school and then later as an adult, and he was eventually disinherited. Parents hoped the lessons of responsibility held fast as their sons went off to college. The freedom indulged in their youth continued in their young adulthood, with parents allowing children responsibility over their own funds and professional choices, but with the explicit understanding that financial restraint was a test of their maturity and manhood. At most, elite white Low Country men would be responsible for plantation economies. College provided an opportunity to demonstrate their fiscal acumen. It was practice. And as would be expected by young men in college, and as a college professor, I can tell you nothing has changed here either, surrounded by other elite white men with ample funds, frugality was not the order of the day. Luckily, they didn't have credit cards in the early 19th century. Society's permissive attitude toward young men's drinking, gambling, and romantic flirtations only escalated the temptation to be led astray outside the watchful gaze of the family. And some of these young men were so rowdy that they employed a kind of a family network person who lived in the region to keep an eye out on them and counsel them and watch over them. Some sons received scornful letters from their kin, encouraging on the path of moderation, and it worked sometimes, and in varying degrees. Although northern schools initially offered the best educational prospects, and this is just a smattering of Low Country colleges from the time period, parents grew increasingly concerned by anti-slavery rhetoric emerging in the northern states in the 19th century. More and more prominent families began sending their sons to southern colleges and universities, and at the College of Charleston, we were founded to be a college for Low Country gentry, and that reputation has stuck, for better or worse. More and more prominent families began sending their sons to these southern colleges, but they wanted to send them so that the institution of slavery remained not only unchallenged, but reinforced by sending them to southern universities. Northern ideas of education differed from those in the South. Colleges for northern families represented an aspiration, not a right. It was the path to self-improvement, career development, and offered the ability to provide financially for one's family. Think self-made, self-reliance. It was decidedly middle class. Education was associated with work for northern men, a necessity to provide financial stability. For southern sons, it reflected more legitimate respectability, and going to a prestigious school enhanced reputation. Already steeped in financial privilege, education was a marker of gentlemanly accomplishment, with less prominence placed on actual scholarship. The grades didn't matter, the reputation did. South Carolinian socialite Alice Izard complained that Northern education placed too much emphasis on academics at the cost of social refinement. She complained in a letter regarding her son's education that, quote, "the graces are not cultivated, nor even those elegant and manly plays and exercises which develop the human figure advantageously," end quote. A reputation for sophisticated manners mattered above all else. But given the high profile and social standing of landed gentry in the Low Country, professional options were very limited. Sons chose professions that would enhance their family and prepare them to be planters and civic leaders. Gentlemanly professions include studying law, economics, or even the emerging field of medicine, although an eyebrow would be raised, it was not quite legitimized this early. These career paths provided respectability, but also prepared young men to become planter patriarchs. Military service existed in a liminal space of acceptance. On one hand, the generation after the American Revolution revered the masculine fortitude of the American military, but those of the Southern gentry focused more on the relationship between military service and great planters, such as George Washington, as opposed to the thousands of unlanded men and women from the Revolution who perished. To serve for a few years was noble and in line with civic virtue in the new republic, particularly in the War of 1812. That was an option to demonstrate manly valor. But a career in the military was deemed unacceptable because it was largely based on merit, not ancestry, and was viewed as a path in which the lower and middle class men could rise to distinction without the privilege of high birth. It was therefore tainted by exposure to the lowly orders. Errant young men who sought to pursue careers outside of these prescribed paths received strongly worded letters reminding them of their positions in society and familial expectations and obligations. Failing to graduate college placed young men in a precarious position with their extended kin who involved themselves in correcting the course of their wayward relatives. Threats of familial exile and disinheritance began appearing in correspondence of college-age men. The threats of poor behavior really take hold in the college age, and mostly because they're drinking and gambling and running up debt, right? Fair. The independence and self-determination of their youth collided with ancestral pressures. The importance placed on class and social distinctions was especially pronounced in the Low Country in the early 19th century. In some places, it still is. Acceptable Southern manhood demanded men pay close attention to their self-presentation. Performing their masculinity required outward signals of wealth and manners. Public perception mattered, and strict social regulations separated white men from poor whites, and especially the enslaved. One need only drive through the Low Country to see the stately plantation homes with large porches, columns, manicured grounds, and opulent furnishings to get a sense of the material manifestations of social status. Displays of wealth and status pervaded the 19th century Low Country, and nowhere as prominently in Charleston in the antebellum period, which was the hub of the Atlantic slave trade. An exceedingly wealthy and important port city in the colonial period, Charleston, more than any other Low Country city, emphasized the performance of elite whiteness. Visitors also remarked on the beauty and elegance of other cities such as Williamsburg, Savannah, and Raleigh, but Charleston received particular notice for its displays of refinement and immense wealth. It was also mocked by Northerners to the same degree. Returning to the virtues extolled by Lord Chesterfield in his advice to his son, in the advice manuals, Charleston families dedicated themselves to replicating aristocratic genteel society. Performing manhood demanded young men adhere to strict expectations of dress, diet, recreations, friends, emotions, and even facial expressions. Men were to have physical strength and not be too heavy, as that denoted overindulgence in food. A lean body conveyed refinement, self-mastery, and virility. They also needed to be visually imposing to assert their authority over enslaved people. Height was prized. They also needed really refined clothing. And I think Elise is here, doesn't she do decorative arts and fabrics and the opulence of early 19th century fabrics? It was extraordinary. But these clothes needed to be tailored, using very fine fabric in European styles. But too opulent, you would be labeled an effeminate fop, a great insult in this time period. We need to bring that back. For some reason, I find that entertaining. But men were trained from birth to engage in thoughtful conversation with controlled emotions and eloquent speech. Fathers placed importance on penmanship and epistolary skills, using proper grammar and avoiding coarse language in correspondence. Manly pursuits of hunting, horse racing, drinking, and gambling with other reputable men of their social class was permissible, but in moderation. Drunkenness, excessive gambling debts, and sexual scandals imperiled a man's reputation and respectability. They also affected his marriage prospects. Marriage itself was a crucial component of achieving manhood in this period. Bachelors were the source of scorn and derision in most of the Revolutionary period and in the early 19th century society. An unmarried boy could never become a man in the eyes of society, and often risked rumors of homosexuality. There's a really great book about this if anybody has questions. Marriage as college was a rite of passage with significantly higher stakes. Parents discouraged sons from forming romantic attachments at college, and especially with Northern women. Men were expected to receive their educations and return home to select a wife within the familiar society of their youth. Marrying locally fortified family power and expanded land holdings. An advantageous marriage elevated both families. This should not be surprising to anybody familiar with Low Country genealogy, because the leading families consistently intermarried, making for some very complicated family trees and a very difficult role for genealogists to kind of tease those things out. Low Country elites operated within a closed society, suspicious of outsiders, and committed to their collective upliftment through marriage and children. Lori Glover wrote that finding a mate was not as simple as a private emotional matter. It was intrinsically bound up in considerations of public reputation and calculated power. Families closely supervised romantic and sexual affairs and tried to ensure that youthful passions did not prevail over gentry ambitions. 19th century visions of marriage were changing, especially in the North, where love attachments were more strongly favored in terms of marital selection. Northern white men, without the pressures of plantation patriarchy and generational status and wealth, exercised more freedom in choosing a partner. Culturally, romantic love became more dominant in 19th century national discourse. This, of course, does not mean that Low Country gentry engaged in loveless marriage. Some of the letters between them are very affectionate and devoted. But it does mean that they weighed considerations of money, property, and political connections more thoroughly. Men were well aware that a poor choice of a mate was detrimental to the reputation and status of him as a man, but it could also result in real disinheritance, a threat made very real in the case of a poor marriage. An extreme example demonstrates the importance of marrying well and into an accepted gentry family. A diary entry by Timothy Ford recalls the story of a young man from South Carolina, the Shipping family. Shipping was their last name, not the profession. He was entangled in a love affair and an elopement with a woman of whom his family deeply disapproved. His family intervened, encouraging him to forget the harlot and marry a woman of his social standing and circle. He refused, was disinherited, and committed suicide. Courtship was highly stylized ritual, conducted under the watchful eye of society and family. Young men were expected to take the lead, asserting the benefits of their greater expectation and social experiences. In turn, young women were coy and reserved in their enthusiasm for potential mates, responding to romantic overtures with openness but reticence. The performative nature of courtship often left young men unsure of the sincere attachments of young women in their circle. But for these men, marriage was the defining moment for young women, an opportunity for them to secure comfort, status, and respectability. Or, if committing early to a poor match for young women, this guaranteed their social exile and perpetual financial struggle. Women and men alike relied upon reputation and family input in selecting worthy candidates. Courtship itself affected reputation. Should either party behave outside of the prescribed rituals of courtship, they faced criticism and scorn from their families and larger communities. Diaries of young men are full of just these, oh, I committed this faux pas, I embarrassed myself in front of lady, right? A lot of anxiety with this. Less articulate or graceful male suitors faced humiliation in their public failures to secure a woman's interest. If a young woman refused a man's proposal of marriage, his reputation was tainted. A weighty decision by young women that was not taken lightly. And in such cases, men were expected to respond with emotional restraint, demonstrating self-mastery. They could cry at home and tell nobody. Once married advantageously, elite white men became fully fledged men in their social sphere, and that achievement came with then the emphasis on mastery, once again. Personal predilections had to give way to duty. For all independence adults encouraged in Southern boys, a Southern man ultimately lived for others, or he was no man at all. Self-mastery, the goal of youth, gave way to the demands of running a plantation. Whether on their own inherited property or through the acquisition of land and slaves through marriage, marriage meant becoming masters, fully fledged manhood. The lessons of their youth, their parents and kin networks really hoped, would prepare these young men to exert authority over their wives, children, and slaves, which in turn marked a man's worthiness for public service and reinforced the Southern social order. We've spent a considerable amount of time talking about what made a successful elite white man in the Low Country in this early national period, but we also need to consider that white manhood came at a cost to others. White masculinity was built in direct relation to enslavement in the Low Country. And white men performed a highly stylized version of masculinity predicated on emasculation of black men. As historian Stephanie McCurry argues, as the South became more cohesive, a more cohesive unit with the spread of plantation economies and slavery in the antebellum period, even yeoman farmers made claims to elite whiteness through the practice of owning slaves and replicating miniature version of planter masculinities. And this occurs right after this period, and you see the unification around this that creates a very powerful political bloc. To align themselves with the privileges of whiteness, and more particularly white manhood, yeoman farmers became ardent advocates of the system that empowered them as propertied men. For the South Carolina Low Country, governance of a household and command of its dependent members were the coordinates of a freeman's public identity. In forcing planters to concede their rights as property men, yeomans also extricated their identity as masters and leased of small worlds within their enclosures. Property, including chattel slaves, defined manhood. Social and class distinctions separated the small-scale landowners from their planter neighbors, certainly, but deeply held beliefs regarding property rights, and by extension slavery, offered a unified whiteness to which they could all lay claim. By extension, political alliance rooted in whiteness and the preservation of slavery as both a right of property and as an institution crucial to the Southern economy offered less wealthy white men avenues into political advancement and elected office. Elite white men's relationship to sexuality, particularly black sexuality, underscores most vividly the extensive purview of the planter patriarch. Men learned early that sexual access to black women's bodies came with the privileges of slave ownership. The extent of sexual exploitation of enslaved women is well documented, but was rarely criticized in the Low Country society of the early national period or in the antebellum period. Only when a white man formed a romantic attachment to a woman in bondage did society take note, and this was exceedingly rare. White men carried on a range of often violent and inherently exploitive sexual relationships with women they held in captivity. The power dynamics of ownership, and that many plantation owners placed their favored victims within the household labor force, which provided easier access, resulted in an ever-present threat of sexual assault. Scholars of white antebellum womanhood, such as Catherine Clinton and Elizabeth Fox Genovese, note the tensions this created within elite white marriages, as white women, also under the umbrella of patriarchy, blamed the enslaved women who often received retaliatory corporal punishment from disaffected wives. Enslaved women faced repeated and doubled victimization. Within black enslaved families, black men could do little to prevent such assaults on the women in their families and communities. The ability to protect a woman's honor, particularly that of a family member or a community member, was endemic to Low Country masculinity, but was denied black husbands, fathers, and brothers who witnessed the consistent abuse of their loved ones. Black men who attempted to intervene or circumvent the lust of the master, much less the woman herself, did so to their own detriment and faced harsh corporal punishments. On occasions, this dynamic resulted in a third tier of violence against enslaved women who became the source of scorn for emasculated black men. Black men could not address white man's aggressions directly, so enacted their frustrations on black women or chose to self-emancipate. I have a story of this that I think I'm kind of crushed for time, but we can talk about it later, of an extreme example where a man ran away from the plantation and left his whole family behind, including his wife and daughter, because he could no longer stand to see them sexually assaulted on a daily basis. That to have a wife or a daughter in the institution of slavery was too much to bear. And you could say that's abandonment, you could say that's freedom for self. There's ways to interpret that, but it was profoundly pervasive. Manhood was only an option through self-liberation, asserting independence and removing oneself to a place where black masculinity could manifest beyond perpetual boyhood. Slave quarters in the 19th century often represented a complicated matrix of genealogy, given the frequency with which enslaved women gave birth to mixed-race children, fathered by owners and their close relatives. And even if you look at this, there's a lot of incest because they would have children by their daughters within enslavement as well. And it's a very complicated incestuous relationships that were very prominent, widespread. 17th century laws from Tidewater, Maryland, Virginia, and early South Carolina placed the lineage of hereditary slavery intentionally through the line of the mother to prevent their illegitimate issue from making claims to freedom. This both perpetuated the expansion of enslaved labor, but also meant that planters' sons and daughters grew up in bondage and faced the same, or in some cases, increased likelihood of sexual violence, even from fathers, cousins, brothers. And yet Southerners critiqued this model, and yet few Southerners critiqued this model, instead accepting it as a natural part of plantation life, and certainly within the rights of male planters. As white wives entered the last months of their confinement, White men sought sexual satisfaction more often in slave quarters in a practice that was widely known as the gander months. Planter fathers and sons preferred enslaved women to frequenting prostitutes. They thought it was better for their reputations, and certainly in the Low Country society it was. But it was the less scandalous option for the 19th century Low Country. It was an open secret, widely accepted. Education, clothing, quality food, marriage, and most importantly, independence were denied men in bondage. Certainly, dehumanization characterized all facets of slavery, but for black men, the denial of manhood was pronounced. Physical labor, the embedded purpose of enslavement, received scorn from elite white men. Planter patriarchs disdained working with their hands and rejected professions for which this would be a requirement. Farming and teaching were unacceptable career choices for gentry men, but planting and professorships were celebrated. One was considered manual and one more cerebral. This hierarchy of labor was defined in decidedly racial ways. Freedom of movement, access to literacy, choosing and committing to marriage, protection and raising of children, selecting a career path, and owning land were all crucial to manhood and all denied black men. As early as 1787, Josiah Wedgwood's design for the British Society for effecting the abolition of the slave trade included the phrase, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This cameo became popular in Britain and the North American abolitionist circles in the 19th century. Used in the Dred Scott decision and later in the civil rights movement of the 20th century, scholars and activists alike recognized the brutality of black emasculation under the institution of slavery. Southern men and women insisted upon referring to black men, regardless of their age and status, as boy throughout the 20th century, as a deliberate act of emasculation. Though less common today, it's a practice still heard in some parts of the Deep South, and always with the intention to humiliate and emasculate, to deny the boy manhood. It's no wonder that African American writers such as Frederick Douglass, Ernest Gaines, Richard Ellison, Richard Wright, August Wilson, James Baldwin, and so many more employed the image of the emasculated black man in their writings and as a struggle of central characters, both real and literary. The making of manhood is and has always been a complicated negotiation of cultural expectations rooted in dominance and power. For men reared in the generation after the American Revolution, the dynamics were especially fraught with competing ideologies, increasingly dictated by the demands of an emerging capitalist economy and slave society. The regional divisions, certainly present in the colonial and revolutionary periods, increased in the antebellum period, essentially providing competing visions of acceptable manhood. Though well beyond the scope of this talk, the repercussions of Low Country masculinity, especially white elite masculinity, reverberated across subsequent generations and are still visible in contemporary conversations around the lost cause of the South, which can easily be understood with scholarly investigations into anxieties of white men who could no longer lay claim to a manhood rooted in mastery and reputation, despite efforts to do so clearly during Reconstruction, in Jim Crow, and even in anti-equity movements today. The path to acceptable and esteemed white manhood, so clearly defined in the early Republic and solidified in the antebellum period, became increasingly less viable and resulted in a series, generations of masculinity crises in America. Thank you.